In the heart of Philadelphia, a city that has long been both a birthplace of American independence and a battleground of urban struggle, the story of Tiffany Wade unfolded with devastating consequences. Known to many by her online persona Nyla Amore, the Blueprint, Tiffany was not just another name in the headlines. She was a mother of three, a registered nurse, a driven entrepreneur, and a woman whose ambition transformed her into a local icon of resilience. Her life was a blend of humble beginnings, professional achievements, social media influence, and the constant balancing act of raising children while running multiple businesses. She was admired not only for her success but also for her faith, her devotion to family, and her ability to reinvent herself. Yet all of these qualities, her independence, her defiance, her prosperity, were precisely what drew the wrath of the man who would ultimately take her life. Born on June 17 in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, Tiffany came from a devoted Muslim family. Faith and perseverance were central to her upbringing, and by the age of 20, she had already earned her nursing license, a milestone that demonstrated her determination and discipline. While many of her peers were still finding their way, Tiffany had committed herself to both a career and to motherhood. She had 3 children whom she adored, and her identity as a mother was inseparable from her identity as a professional and businesswoman. But she was not content with only one role. In addition to nursing, she expanded into entrepreneurship, launching businesses that carried her name and vision. Kisses Care Home Care offered health services. Kisses Amore Extensions sold luxury hair products, and Seasoned Kisses represented her latest creative venture. For Tiffany, work was not just about survival. It was about empowerment, legacy, and proving to herself and others that she could turn ambition into reality. Her social media presence magnified her impact. Under the persona Nyla Amore, the Blueprint, Tiffany cultivated a following that saw her as both glamorous and inspiring. Every morning, she posted reminders rooted in her faith, urging her audience to read the Quran, to stay grounded, to keep striving. Every evening, she showcased her success, from luxury shopping sprees with Chanel, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and Dior to glimpses of international travel in London and Egypt. To her followers, she was the embodiment of determination rewarded. Her posts exuded confidence, elegance, and motivation. Yet behind the curated images of handbags and birthday celebrations, Tiffany also shared moments of vulnerability and reflection. She often posted messages about storms caused by choices, about people taking others for granted, about humility, and about the inevitability of accountability. These posts hinted at her awareness of danger, of threats looming close, though few realized just how literal those threats would become. At the center of Tiffany's turbulent personal life was a man named Armand Hilton. He was the father of her youngest child, once her husband, and eventually her greatest threat. At 44 years old, Armand carried a long criminal record that included kidnapping, armed robbery, and weapons violations. He was a man both feared and respected on the streets of Chester, Pennsylvania, where his reputation was cemented through violence and intimidation. Years in prison had done little to reform him. Instead, he spent those years planning for what he would do upon release. Armand believed in power, control, and ownership, values that translated into both his personal relationships and his business dealings. To him, Tiffany was not a partner but a possession, someone who owed loyalty, obedience, and silence. When he transferred properties into her name to shield them from asset seizure due to his criminal activities, He assumed she would hold them as a caretaker until his return. He never imagined she would transform those assets into her own thriving empire. The divergence of their lives after his imprisonment was stark. Tiffany flourished, building businesses, raising her children, and sharing her success with the world. Armand, on the other hand, stewed in resentment, convinced that his empire had been stolen, that his woman had betrayed him. For him, loyalty meant submission, and Tiffany's independence was nothing short of theft. The fact that she not only cut him off but also found love with another man compounded his rage. He viewed her achievements not as triumphs of her own making but as insults, as evidence that she had used his resources to build a life without him. In his worldview, where love and ownership were inseparable, this was unforgivable. To understand Tiffany's murder is to understand the intersection of her identity with Armand's pathology. She was a woman of ambition and faith, who sought to uplift others while securing a future for her children. She was determined to thrive despite hardship, despite widowhood of sorts, despite the legacy of violence that hovered around her ex-husband. Armand, by contrast, was a man unable to relinquish control, whose sense of self was tied to domination. Their connection through their son ensured that their lives remained entangled, but it also gave Armand leverage to continue exerting power even after their separation. His threats, often explicit and chilling, reflected not only jealousy, but a worldview where a woman's success outside his control was a direct affront to his masculinity and authority. The tragedy of Tiffany's story lies partly in the visibility of its warning signs. She did not hide her fear. She posted screenshots of Armand's threats, shared his violent words with her thousands of followers, and made it known that she was living under the shadow of danger. Her transparency was both a cry for help and a testament to her defiance. She refused to be silenced, even as she knew the risks. Many of her followers admired her courage, but some dismissed the threats as bluster, as the ranting of a bitter man incapable of moving on. Yet Tiffany understood more than anyone else what kind of danger she was in. Her posts were breadcrumbs, a digital diary of her anticipation of violence. They would later become evidence, but at the time they served as warnings ignored by the very society that now mourns her. General information about the Tiffany Wade case thus paints a dual portrait. On one hand, of a woman who represented resilience, empowerment, and ambition, and on the other, of a man whose identity was inseparable from violence, control, and vengeance. Their story was not one of equal partners, but of a relationship defined by imbalance and eventual betrayal. Tiffany rose above her circumstances, becoming a symbol of what could be achieved even from difficult beginnings. Armand, meanwhile, remained shackled to his past, a man incapable of envisioning a future that did not revolve around his dominance. By October 2023, the collision course between these two lives was inevitable. Tiffany, thriving as a businesswoman and mother, stood as the embodiment of independence. Armand, freshly released from prison, saw in her success not only betrayal, but humiliation. His threats were not idle. They were promises waiting to be fulfilled. The general background of both victim and perpetrator sets the stage for a case where ambition met obsession, where freedom clashed with ownership, and where the cost of defiance was paid in blood. The story of Tiffany Wade's final days reads like a tragic countdown, each moment marked by warnings that went unheard or unheeded. From the moment Armand Hilton stepped out of prison, The trajectory of events became clear. He had spent years behind bars thinking not of redemption or rebuilding his life, but of reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. His businesses, his properties, and, most importantly, his control over Tiffany. She, however, had moved on. The empire he thought she was safeguarding for him had become her foundation for independence. The woman he once commanded was now thriving without him, her loyalty redirected toward her children and her new partner. To Armand, this was not just betrayal. It was a theft of identity and status. And so the weeks that followed his release were marked by escalating threats that everyone could see coming, yet no one could stop. Social media became the stage on which their conflict played out. Tiffany, always active online, shared not only her glamorous shopping trips and business successes, but also the violent words Armand hurled at her. "Stop throwing it in my face before I kill you," he wrote in one chilling message. In another, he declared, "You ain't making it out of Philly. I'm a psychopath." These were not veiled insinuations but direct promises of violence. Tiffany's decision to post them publicly was both an act of defiance and a safeguard. She wanted the world to know what she was facing, perhaps believing that exposure would offer protection. Instead, the posts became a grim record of her awareness that her past was catching up with her. Thousands of followers watched, many offering encouragement, others dismissing the threats as the bitter ramblings of a man scorned. But Tiffany knew better. She had lived with him, seen his temper, and understood the gravity behind his words. Despite her fear, Tiffany continued to live her life as fully as possible. She ran her businesses, cared for her children, and embraced her new relationship. Her Instagram stories were filled with positivity, reminders to her followers to stay focused, to cut out distractions, to push through hardships. Yet beneath the motivational tone, a thread of fatalism began to emerge. "Every storm is not a test from God. Some storms are from the choices you made," she posted, a cryptic acknowledgement that her current danger was linked to decisions in her past. She knew Armand was dangerous. She knew he would come for her, and still she refused to relinquish the life she had built. Whether this was courage, stubbornness, or a belief that he would not truly act in front of their son, Tiffany held her ground in Philadelphia, even as the threats mounted. The fateful day arrived on the 7th of October 2023. It began like any other Saturday for Tiffany and her children. She woke early, prayed, brewed her morning coffee, and checked her business orders. She prepared breakfast with her 3 children, the chaos of family life filling her home. Her youngest, a 7-year-old boy she shared with Armand, needed a haircut. Tiffany bundled him into the car, the routine errand feeling ordinary, even mundane. Her last Instagram story, posted at 11:47 a.m., read, "Stay focused. Your time is coming. Cut out distractions." It was a message of perseverance to her followers, but within hours it would become her final words to the world. At around 1:15 p.m., Tiffany pulled up outside Platinum Cuts, a barber shop on West Lehigh Avenue in North Philadelphia. The neighborhood was familiar, the kind of place where barber shops doubled as community centers, where men gathered to talk sports, politics, and street news. Inside, the atmosphere was typical. The hum of clippers, the smell of hair products, the banter of customers and barbers. Tiffany's son climbed into the chair, the cape fastened around his small frame. Tiffany scrolled through her phone, answering messages about hair extension orders, multitasking as mothers do. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, at 1:47 p.m., the door chimed. Tiffany looked up and froze. Standing in the doorway was Armand Hilton. For weeks, she had dreaded this moment. And now it was here. Witnesses later described the scene as surreal. He entered with no hesitation, no attempt at conversation. He raised his gun, and within seconds, 2 shots rang out. One bullet struck Tiffany in the torso, the other in the head. The clippers stopped buzzing. Conversations died. The barber shop, once filled with routine chatter, fell silent except for the sound of a child's scream. Her 7-year-old son, still caped in the barber chair, watched in horror as his mother collapsed to the floor. "Mommy!" he cried, his voice desperate, primal, cutting through the stunned silence. Armand did not stay to witness the aftermath. He turned and fled, leaving behind his own child's anguished cries. The scene was chaos. Barbers and customers frozen in shock, then scrambling to call 911. Blood pooled on the floor as Tiffany lay motionless. At 1:49 p.m., the first emergency call came in. By 2:04 p.m., paramedics pronounced Tiffany dead. The speed of the violence, the brutality of its execution, and the presence of her son made the murder especially horrifying. This was not a crime of passion carried out in private. It was a public execution, a message delivered in broad daylight. Armand had promised he would kill her, and he did so exactly as he said he would, in front of witnesses, in front of their child, with chilling precision. The aftermath inside the barber shop was one of stunned devastation. Customers who had come in for a haircut were now witnesses to murder. The owner, his livelihood forever stained by blood, tried to comfort Tiffany's son while waiting for the police. The boy, traumatized and silent after his screams, sat with a crisis counselor later that afternoon. For him, the last image of his mother would forever be her body falling to the floor under the weight of 2 gunshots. News of the killing spread quickly. Within hours, Tiffany's followers, friends, and family flooded social media with posts of grief and outrage. Justice for Tiffany began trending, as screenshots of Armand's threats circulated widely. Many pointed out that the warning signs had been there all along. Tiffany had posted them, shared them, made them public, yet no one had intervened in time. The community was split. Some mourned her as a queen, a mother, a businesswoman who had built success from nothing. Others, revealing the insidious nature of victim blaming, questioned why she had kept Armand's properties, why she had stayed in Philadelphia, why she had not fled. These debates added insult to injury, obscuring the simple truth that she had been murdered for daring to be independent. The case developments leading up to Tiffany's death reveal not just a sequence of events, but a slow-motion tragedy. The threats were real, the warnings explicit, the danger undeniable, and yet, Tiffany continued to live, to build, to post, to inspire. Her courage was matched only by her vulnerability, a vulnerability that ended in gunfire on the floor of a neighborhood barbershop. The developments of October 7 did not come as a surprise. They were the fulfillment of promises made by a man who saw violence as the only way to reclaim power. When the paramedics pronounced Tiffany Wade dead at 2:04 p.m. on the 7th of October 2023, the North Philadelphia barber shop where she fell was transformed into a crime scene. The bright Saturday chatter, the clippers humming, and the ordinary rituals of a haircut were replaced with the shrill cries of her 7-year-old son and the cold, methodical movements of homicide detectives. Yellow police tape stretched across the storefront of Platinum Cuts as officers cleared the crowd that had begun to gather on West Lehigh Avenue. Word spread quickly another shooting in Philadelphia. But this time, the victim was a well-known entrepreneur and mother of 3, whose murder had been preceded by weeks of public threats. Detective Raymond Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the Philadelphia Police Department, took charge of the investigation. The first order of business was to secure evidence inside the barber shop. 2 9mm shell casings were collected from the floor. Blood pooled around Tiffany's body, photographs captured from multiple angles, and witness statements were taken from customers and barbers who had been present. The security cameras mounted at the corner of the shop provided crucial footage. At 1:47 p.m., a man entered, identified instantly by Tiffany before she was gunned down. There was no hesitation, no conversation, only 2 deliberate shots before he fled. The shooter's face was unmistakable. Armand Hilton, age 44, her ex-husband, and the father of her youngest son. Back at police headquarters, Armand's record filled the screen: kidnapping, armed robbery, weapons violations, assault. His reputation was well known in Chester, Pennsylvania, a city only 40 minutes away, notorious for its entrenched crime networks. Detectives understood immediately that this was not a case where the suspect would willingly surrender. He was a man accustomed to living outside the law, with connections who would help him hide. The challenge was not identifying the killer but catching him before he vanished into the shadows of the street life he knew so well. Social media became both a resource and a pressure point in the investigation. Tiffany's followers flooded the internet with screenshots of Armand's previous threats, many of which she had shared herself in the weeks leading up to her death. Messages like, "You ain't making it out of Philly," and "I'm a psychopath" circulated widely, painting a picture of premeditation. Detectives used these posts as evidence, establishing a timeline of escalating threats that culminated in murder. But social media also amplified the urgency. Justice for Tiffany trended within hours, with thousands demanding answers, accountability, and immediate action. For the police, the visibility meant heightened pressure to deliver results quickly. Every hour Armand remained at large was seen as a failure. By 4:30 p.m., an all-points bulletin was issued for Armand Hilton, labeling him armed and dangerous. Officers in Philadelphia, Chester, and surrounding counties received his photo and description. The FBI entered the case by evening, elevating it from a local homicide to a federal manhunt once it became clear that Armand might attempt to flee across state lines. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office filed charges of first-degree murder, illegal possession of a firearm, and related offenses. A reward of $20,000 was announced for information leading to his arrest and conviction. Tips began pouring in almost immediately. Some claimed he was seen at a gas station in Chester. Others insisted he was hiding in North Philadelphia, while another tip suggested he was preparing to cross into Delaware. Each lead had to be verified, each sighting investigated, stretching the already thin resources of law enforcement. Jurisdictional challenges compounded the difficulties. Philadelphia police, Chester police, and federal agents each had their own systems, priorities, and protocols. Coordination took time, and in a manhunt, time is the enemy. Armand's ability to evade capture reflected both his street knowledge and the network of people willing to shelter him. Former associates owed him favors, while others feared his retribution if they refused to help. Chester and Philadelphia's proximity worked in his favor, close enough to slip between the two cities, far enough that investigators often lost track of him. Reports emerged of him acquiring fake identification documents and withdrawing cash, signs that he was preparing to leave the country. Talk circulated that he had connections who could facilitate his escape abroad, though whether this was rumor or fact remained uncertain. Meanwhile, Tiffany's family was left to grapple with the immediate aftermath. Her father, now the guardian figure for her children, stood outside the mosque accepting condolences, his face hollow with grief. The Muslim community organized prayers in her honor, a gesture of solidarity that underscored the depth of the loss. For her children, the pain was indescribable. Her eldest daughter, already mature beyond her years, stepped into the role her mother once played, caring for her siblings with a strength forged from necessity. The 7-year-old boy who had witnessed the murder was placed under counseling, though the trauma of watching his mother die at the hands of his father would never fully heal. The investigation faced not only logistical challenges but also cultural ones. In communities like Chester and North Philadelphia, the no-snitching code runs deep. Even those who knew where Armand was hiding hesitated to speak, fearing violent repercussions. Others remained silent, not out of loyalty, but from survival. For detectives, breaking through this wall of silence required a combination of pressure, incentives, and patience. The $20,000 reward became a critical tool, appealing to those willing to trade information for safety and money. Yet even with the reward, leads remained inconsistent. As weeks turned into months, frustration mounted. Justice delayed is justice denied, community leaders proclaimed, pointing to Tiffany's case as an example of how systemic failures allow dangerous men to continue terrorizing women even after public threats. The fact that she had documented those threats, shared them widely, and still ended up dead, left many questioning the adequacy of protective measures. Restraining orders, police awareness, and social media documentation had all been in place, yet none had prevented the murder. For women living in similar circumstances, the message was chilling. Even when the danger is visible, the system cannot guarantee protection. By early 2024, Armand Hilton remained a fugitive, his face plastered across wanted posters and news broadcasts, his name synonymous with betrayal and violence. Each anniversary of Tiffany's birthday or death brought renewed calls for justice, her children honoring her memory with heartbreaking tributes online. "Your legacy will live on," her eldest daughter wrote in one post, embodying both grief and resilience. For detectives, the case became a matter of both professional duty and moral weight. To capture Armand was not only to secure justice for Tiffany but also to prove that the system could still deliver accountability in the face of blatant violence. The outcome of the immediate investigation was grimly straightforward. Tiffany had been murdered in cold blood, in public, by a man who had promised for weeks that he would do it. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage, eyewitness accounts, forensic proof, and digital threats. The process of capturing the suspect, however, was far from simple. Armand's ability to evade law enforcement reflected both his criminal savvy and the cracks in a system stretched thin by countless other cases of urban violence. For the family, for the community, and for the countless women who saw themselves in Tiffany's story, the unanswered question lingered: when will he be caught? And until he is, what does justice truly mean? The murder of Tiffany Wade was not an inexplicable act of sudden rage, nor was it a crime born purely out of passion. It was the culmination of a long, festering narrative of ownership, betrayal, and control. To understand why Tiffany was killed, one must dissect both the individual motives of her killer, Armand Hilton, and the broader social, cultural, and systemic forces that shaped their relationship. At its core, this was a crime about power, the power a man believed he was entitled to wield over a woman, and the fatal consequences when she refused to yield. Armand Hilton was a man molded by the culture of the streets and the codes of survival behind prison walls. His criminal record reflected more than isolated misdeeds. It reflected a lifetime of choices that reinforced his identity as someone who could not be crossed. Kidnapping, armed robbery, weapons violations, each conviction underscored a willingness to use intimidation and violence to achieve his goals. Prison, rather than rehabilitating him, entrenched his worldview. He viewed loyalty as obedience, love as possession, and betrayal as a crime punishable by death. When he placed his properties and businesses in Tiffany's name, it was not an act of trust but of strategy. She was, in his mind, a temporary caretaker, a custodian who would hold his assets until he could reclaim them. He never imagined she would claim them as her own, much less transform them into legitimate businesses that bore her name and success. For Tiffany, however, those years were transformative. While Armand served his sentence, she discovered not only her competence, but her capacity to thrive independently. She managed the properties, learned to invest, and expanded into new ventures. She became a nurse, an entrepreneur, a community presence, and an online influencer. The assets Armand left behind were not anchors keeping her tied to him. They became stepping stones toward her own future. In doing so, she rewrote the script he had assigned her. Instead of remaining a passive placeholder, she emerged as an empowered woman, unwilling to return what she had built. To Armand, this was not only theft, but humiliation. His identity as a man, as a provider, as someone feared and respected, was challenged by the fact that a woman, his wife, no less, had turned what was his into something greater, and refused to give it back. Armand's threats reveal the psychology of a man consumed by this humiliation. His words, captured in screenshots Tiffany posted online, oscillated between declarations of psychopathy and chillingly specific promises of violence. "I'm a psychopath. You ain't making it out of Philly," he wrote. In another message he swore, "I'm blowing his head off on everything I love. I'm going back to prison. I don't give a..." These were not idle words. They reflected both his intent and his warped sense of inevitability. For Armand, prison was not a deterrent but an acceptable consequence. Killing Tiffany was not about freedom. It was about reclaiming dominance, even if it meant sacrificing his own. His threats, then, were not empty bluffs but rehearsals for the act he would eventually commit. The cultural dynamics of their relationship also demand examination. Tiffany came from a devoted Muslim family, raised with values of faith and perseverance. In her community, loyalty to one's husband carried weight, particularly when raising children together. In the early years of her marriage to Armand, standing by him even during his imprisonment may have felt like an obligation, a continuation of cultural expectations. But years change people. For Tiffany, independence was not just survival, it became empowerment. For Armand, those same years hardened his belief that loyalty was eternal and non-negotiable. When Tiffany broke that unspoken contract, when she locked him out, sold properties, cut him off, and found a new partner. She violated not just his expectations, but the patriarchal foundation of his identity. Her independence became his emasculation, and in his worldview, emasculation demanded retribution. At the societal level, the Tiffany Wade case exposes glaring systemic failures in how threats of domestic violence are treated. Tiffany did not hide her fear. She posted screenshots of Armand's messages, shared his words with thousands of followers, and effectively documented the timeline of escalating danger. These posts were breadcrumbs for anyone willing to look, evidence that she anticipated her own murder. Yet the system failed to intervene. There is no indication that protective measures were effectively enforced, no sign that law enforcement treated his threats with the urgency they demanded. The culture of dismissing threats as just words proved fatal. Tiffany's death highlights a painful truth. In cases of domestic violence, threats are rarely empty. They are warnings of the violence to come. Moreover, the aftermath revealed the toxic culture of victim blaming that often shadows such tragedies. While many mourned Tiffany as a mother, nurse, and entrepreneur, others questioned her decisions. Why did she keep his properties? Some asked. Why didn't she leave Philadelphia? These questions, while framed as curiosity, carried undertones of judgment that shifted responsibility away from the killer and onto the victim. They ignored the reality that Tiffany had every right to stay in her city, to keep what she had built, to live her life without fear of execution. To suggest otherwise is to normalize control, to accept the idea that women must relinquish their independence to stay safe. Such narratives perpetuate the cycle of abuse by framing survival as submission. The deeper motive behind Tiffany's murder, then, lies in the collision between empowerment and entitlement. Tiffany embodied empowerment. She rose above her circumstances, built businesses, and inspired others. Armand embodied entitlement. He believed he owned her businesses, her choices, and her future. When empowerment confronted entitlement, violence became his solution. He could not control her through persuasion, intimidation, or threats. So, he resorted to the ultimate act of control, taking her life. From a legal perspective, the case is a textbook example of first-degree murder. Armand's threats demonstrated premeditation. His decision to walk into a barbershop armed, to fire 2 precise shots, and to flee immediately afterward leaves no doubt about intent. But beyond the legal classification, the case represents something more profound. It is a study in how personal motives are shaped by cultural norms and systemic failures. Armand's motive was rooted in his need to reassert dominance. Tiffany's death was made possible by a society that normalized male control, dismissed women's fears, and failed to act even when the danger was publicly documented. The analysis of this case must, therefore, extend beyond the individual. Yes, Armand Hilton pulled the trigger, but his actions were enabled by broader patterns. The glamorization of control disguised as love, the systemic indifference to domestic violence threats, the cultural stigmas that silence women, and the community divisions that fuel victim blaming. Tiffany's murder was personal, but it was also political. It reflected not only one man's pathology, but also the conditions that allowed that pathology to manifest unchecked. In the end, the motive is as old as patriarchy itself. A man's refusal to accept a woman's autonomy. Tiffany dared to live freely, to succeed without him, to love someone else, to own what he thought was his. For that, she was punished in the most brutal way possible. The lesson her story leaves behind is chilling but necessary. When society fails to take threats seriously, when it excuses control as passion, and when it blames victims for their independence, it creates the conditions for tragedies like Tiffany's to unfold. The story of Tiffany Wade ends not with the life she built, but with the violent way it was taken from her. On the 7th of October 2023, she walked into Platinum Cuts with her 7-year-old son, expecting nothing more than a haircut, an errand as ordinary as any other Saturday. Less than an hour later, she lay lifeless on the floor, killed by the man who once called her his wife. For Tiffany's children, her father, and her community, the loss was not just the extinguishing of a single life, but the unraveling of a future that had seemed so promising. Tiffany had become a symbol of perseverance, faith, and independence, yet her story now serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when empowerment collides with entitlement, when freedom becomes a threat to those who believe they own another person. At its simplest, the conclusion is devastatingly clear. Tiffany Wade was murdered because she chose to live life on her own terms. She refused to return to the man who had controlled her, refused to hand back the businesses she had built, refused to surrender her right to love freely and independently. These choices, ordinary in a just world, became extraordinary provocations in the eyes of Armand Hilton. To him, her autonomy was betrayal, her independence theft, her success humiliation. His decision to kill her was not spontaneous but deliberate, a calculated attempt to reassert control through the most final and irreversible act. He shot her not because he loved her, but because he could not bear the reality of losing ownership over her. But Tiffany's murder is not just about one man's violence. It is about the broader failures that allowed that violence to unfold in plain sight. Tiffany did not hide her fear. She posted his threats online, showed the world the danger she lived with, and effectively documented the countdown to her own death. Yet those warnings did not trigger effective intervention. There were no protective barriers strong enough to shield her, no systemic mechanisms fast enough to preempt the inevitable. Her murder exposes the painful truth that even when women speak, when they shout, when they make their terror public, too often the response is indifference until it is too late. In the days after her death, her community was torn between grief and blame. Vigils were held, prayers offered at the mosque, and hashtags like "Number Justice for Tiffany" trended across social media. Friends and followers mourned her as a queen, a mother, a businesswoman who had built success from nothing. Yet amid the tributes, a darker current flowed. Some questioned why she stayed in Philadelphia, why she kept Armand's properties, why she did not simply leave and start over elsewhere. These questions, posed under the guise of logic, were in reality echoes of victim blaming. They implied that Tiffany bore responsibility for her fate, that she could have avoided her death if only she had surrendered what was hers. Such narratives miss the point entirely. The only person responsible for Tiffany's murder is the man who pulled the trigger. To shift the focus onto her choices is to excuse the culture of control and violence that killed her. For her children, the conclusion is even harsher. They must live not only with the loss of their mother but with the knowledge that their father caused it. Her eldest daughter has already stepped into the role Tiffany once held, caring for her siblings with strength far beyond her years. Her youngest son carries the trauma of having witnessed the murder, his childhood indelibly scarred by that single afternoon. Their lives will forever be divided into before and after the 7th of October 2023. Yet, in their resilience, in their determination to honor her legacy, Tiffany's spirit endures. Each birthday celebrated in her absence, each milestone marked without her, becomes both a tribute to her love and a reminder of what was stolen. On a societal level, Tiffany's case is a wake-up call. It underscores the urgent need to take threats seriously, to recognize that words can and often do translate into action. When a man with a history of violence declares, "I am a psychopath, you ain't making it out of Philly," those words are not bravado but prophecy. Tiffany's murder demands that law enforcement, social services, and communities treat such warnings with the gravity they deserve. Protective measures must be strengthened, intervention systems streamlined, and cultural attitudes reshaped so that women are not left to fend for themselves against men who see them as possessions. The legacy Tiffany leaves behind is twofold. On one hand, it is the legacy of a woman who rose from modest beginnings to become a nurse, entrepreneur, and mother who inspired countless others. She demonstrated what resilience and ambition could achieve, proving that women could transform hardship into empowerment. On the other hand, her legacy is a cautionary tale of how fragile that empowerment can be when society fails to protect it. Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that for many women, success is not only a dream achieved but a risk endured. For Armand Hilton, the conclusion is unfinished. He remains a fugitive, a shadow moving between cities, sustained by networks of fear and silence. Each day he remains free prolongs the agony of Tiffany's family. Each year without justice deepens the wound. His capture and conviction may one day bring closure, but it will not restore what has been lost. Justice, in this case, is delayed, and in many ways, denied. Yet the pursuit itself is important. It sends a message that even those who believe they can disappear, who think they are untouchable, cannot escape accountability forever. Ultimately, the conclusion of the Tiffany Wade case is not found in a courtroom or in a sentence, but in the lessons it forces us to carry forward. It reminds us that control disguised as love is not love at all but violence waiting to happen. It teaches that ignoring red flags can be fatal, that victim blaming perpetuates harm, and that silence in the face of abuse is complicity. Most of all, it demands that we see women like Tiffany not as cautionary tales of what happens when you defy a man, but as reminders of why defiance is necessary, why independence is worth fighting for, and why protection of that independence must be a collective responsibility. Tiffany Wade's story could have ended differently. It could have been remembered purely as one of triumph, a young mother who built businesses, inspired her community, and raised her children with faith and love. Instead, it is remembered as a story of betrayal and blood, a narrative hijacked by a man who refused to let her go. But even in death, Tiffany's legacy resists erasure. Her children carry her strength, her followers continue to share her words. Her life, though cut short, stands as both an inspiration and a warning. The final conclusion is that Tiffany Wade was more than her murder. She was a blueprint of resilience, and her story challenges us to ensure that no other woman's blueprint ends the same way.